Welcome, everybody, to today's Scientist Rebellion talk with guest speaker Dr. Tejal Kanitkar. Tejal is an associate professor in the School of Natural Sciences and Engineering at the National Institute of Advanced Studies in Bengaluru, India. Her work integrates perspectives from the natural sciences, from engineering, and from the social sciences to understand the interconnected aspects of energy production and access, environmental impacts, and socioeconomic development. In particular, she works on ways to operationalize equity and justice in the era of acute environmental crises, including, of course, the climate crisis. My name is Fabian. I'm a postdoc at the University of Amsterdam, and I will be hosting this session. Tejal will talk for about 30 to 40 minutes, after which there will be ample time for Q&A. So you can ask your questions either in the Zoom chat, or by raising your hand using the Zoom functionality during the Q&A. And after the Q&A, there will be a short talk about Scientist Rebellion and how you can get involved. Note that there is interpretation in Spanish and French available, I believe, and that the session will be recorded. So if you don't want your video to be shown, please just turn it off. Also, please mute yourself if you're not muted, so that we can hear Tejal very well. Without further ado, then we're very happy to have you. Please, Tejal, take it away.
Thank you so much, Fabian and Julia, for inviting me and organizing this. Let me just share my screen and get to it right away. Yes, I hope my screen is visible.
Yes.
All right. So at the outset, let me say that the work that I will present today has been done in collaboration with colleagues, other colleagues from India, Jayaraman from the MS Swaminathan Research Foundation, which is in Chennai, and Akhil Maitri, who was at NIAS but has subsequently moved to another institute, and Ankita Ranjan, who is a research scholar at NIAS. So it's a difficult topic to speak about in 30 to 40 minutes. I think something as fundamental as the questions of equity and justice, especially in the context of environmental problems, and particularly in the context of climate change, I think requires far more discussion, especially if you have a cross-section of audience like the way I have. But I am going to focus on one particular aspect of this, and this is related to a whole lot of numbers that we have been seeing recently, since the Paris Agreement was signed, but much more so in recent years. Right, we have the COP26 in Glasgow. The COP decision had global numbers for emissions reductions. The IPCC reports have been released in over the last 3 years, and some of the numbers from the scenarios of the IPCC reports and the summary for policymakers have made it to the media. And so when we listen to hear about climate change, we do have to contend with understanding what these numbers are. What does a 43% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions by 2030 mean? What does net zero by 2050 mean? And what does it mean in a world that is starkly differentiated and unequal? So let me begin by saying that what these documents do not talk about is basically a much more established fact that temperature rise or global warming is almost linearly, directly proportional to cumulative emissions. Right? So you have from a historical time period, and carbon dioxide, of course, stays in the atmosphere for a very long time. You have emissions that you have cumulative emissions from pre-industrial times till now, which has already led to the warming that we are witnessing today, which is about 1.1 degrees Celsius. And what we have remaining for limiting warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius, with even a 50% chance of making this target, is very, very less. So 4/5 of the carbon budget available for a 50% probability of limiting warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius is already exhausted. A large part of this, a very highly disproportionate share, by the OECD countries, with only 18% of the population responsible for 39% of the CO2 emissions. This is not all greenhouse gases, this is only CO2. Whereas the rest of the world, again, is responsible for 46%. What you have left, the RCB stands for the remaining carbon budget between 2022 and the time at which emissions would reach net zero. So only 15% of this is left for the 1.5 degrees Celsius target, and only 30% is left for the 2 degrees, for a 67% probability of limiting warming to 2 degrees Celsius. So that's a very, very tight constraint in terms of what kind of space, atmospheric space, is available for the future. This, however, has not made it. You have other numbers that have made it to climate policy documents, the GHG reduction numbers and net zero numbers, but there is no carbon budget number that has made it to climate policy discussions. And there are, of course, reasons for it. The Paris Agreement doesn't have this. But since then, the carbon budgets is something that has been part of the science of climate change since a long time. The AR5 established this, the fifth assessment report of the IPCC, which was 2013. So the science was available even before 2013. However, this doesn't make it to the Paris Agreement, despite developing countries, in fact, asking for it to be included. This doesn't make it. But now that you have an agreement which is basically voluntary targets for everybody, it's not just voluntary targets for developing countries, but top-down targets for developed countries. You have everybody pledges what they would do, and you sort of aggregate these pledges and see what they mean at the global level. People have started talking about the carbon budget. When very little of it is left, it has become an important subject, and scholars from the global north have also started writing about it. But if you actually trace back the literature on carbon budgets, especially in the context of climate policy, how this budget should be distributed, what does it mean in terms of fair shares, there has been literature from the global south dating, from at least over 15 years ago. Right, more than that perhaps. So there is literature that goes back a long way. However, it's not really made it into climate policy discussions. It has not even made it as strongly in civil society discourses on this. However, you have now northern scholars writing about it, so perhaps the situation would change. Things happen far more quickly if the same things that have been said by scholars from the global south actually get said by scholars from the global north. It's an unfortunate situation, but it is a reality that we have to contend with. So you have very little of the carbon budget left, and the narrative, however, for the future, and this is true of largely in the developed countries, but not just true of the governments of developed countries, also academia and civil society, that the focus is on global ambition for 1.5, and this ambition is often spoken about without any reference to differentiation, to the fact that we live in a starkly unequal world, a world unequal not only in terms of who will face the impacts, but a world also unequal in terms of who is responsible for the problem, what kind of energy access do people have across the world, what kind of energy services people have access to across the world, infrastructure, the number of people living in slums, the number of schools, hospitals that are available across countries. But however, this doesn't make it to the discourse, doesn't make it to the headlines. There are no historical emissions. Any discussion in climate policy, especially at the negotiations on historical emissions, is opposed. You want a forward-looking agenda, future warming due to future emissions. Let's forget that we are already at 1.1 degrees Celsius. Any discussion or demand for equity is seen as an obstacle for ambition. So you actually have developed country interlocutors, negotiators saying that, equity cannot be something that you use to deny ambition. And of course, you have, global targets. You have it's a global collective action problem. You need all countries to participate in solving the problem. You have Therefore, you need to have the 1.5 and the 2 degrees Celsius targets are global targets. So you need to have global emissions targets and some benchmarks. But who decides what these benchmarks are? Right? And across the history of climate policy, you've had shifting goalposts in terms of what these benchmarks are. The UNFCCC didn't, the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change did not specify targets. It just spoke about principles, obligations, and commitments of different countries and country groups to address the problem of anthropogenic global warming. The Kyoto Protocol had specific targets for developed countries. They were also supposed to continue those to what is called the second commitment period of the Kyoto Protocol, or the pre-2020 pledges that have become so contentious. Developed countries, however, have started speaking about the problem or about solutions to the problem as though the world began in 2020. The Paris Agreement comes into effect in 2020, but the problem did not begin in 2020. Neither did discussions about the problem begin in 2020. However, the thrust is forward-looking, like I said. But you have targets, concrete targets in the Paris Agreement, well below 2 degrees Celsius, pursue efforts to limit warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. And since then, of course, there are other numbers that have entered the discussions. The Glasgow Pact has 43% reduction by 2030 and net zero by 2050 to meet the 1.5 degrees Celsius target. You have other potential discussions and demands. If you look at country submissions, which are also openly available to anybody, to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, you have calls for targets for global peaking of emissions. You have calls for targets for 2035. You have calls for global renewable energy targets. So you have a whole range of these things. Now, where do these targets come from? Where do these numbers come from? Why 43%? Why not 44%? Why not 45%? Why is a specific number for reduction for 2030? These come from, IPCC, and this is quoted often as the best available science. Now, I know that a lot of scholars and scholar activists, there's a large overlap in these categories across the world, especially scholars working on climate change, consider the IPCC to be the most authoritative voice. But, it has unprecedented amounts of assessment of literature over a large period of time, gives you the latest knowledge on what people are saying, what other academics are saying, etc. Right? But there is a specific focus of a lot of the summary for policymakers, especially in the 6th assessment report and perhaps the previous one as well. And then what gets picked up from these reports into climate policy documents, also because this is what gets picked up by media, because it makes for very good headlines. It gets picked up by civil society organizations, again, because and this is, not always, you don't always know it, but I mean, most of this is well-intentioned, right? It's to get governments to act, to get those who are supposed to act, you need to make sure that you put forward, statements, or you put forward an understanding that this is a serious problem and we have to deal with it. We have to get our act together to deal with it. However, these numbers then that get picked up that I'm talking about come from the IPCC. The questions therefore are, does IPCC produce these scenarios, or does it simply assess these scenarios? And the IPCC, of course, states that these scenarios are not theirs. They only assess the scenarios, they don't produce the scenarios. So where do these scenarios come from? A large number of those scenarios, and in fact, most of the scenarios that give you global numbers, come from integrated assessment models. Now, I am not going to go into details of what these models are, just a very brief overview, but this is where it comes from. There's one model of all the models that are being used to produce scenarios and then eventually assessed by the IPCC. one model from the global south. All the other models are based in the global north. Right? Then does the IPCC, again, going beyond this, assess all scenarios that are available in the literature? Or does it assess a subset? And what lies beneath these global numbers? Global numbers are eventually aggregates. There is no global investment in renewable energy. There is no global deployment of solar PV. Countries do it, right? States do it. There are actors within states that do this. Energy requirements, production is driven by national processes. You can, of course, post facto aggregate all of this and talk about what a global number looks like, but it is a post facto aggregation. But what drives the process is national policy and national governance. So there is, of course, there has to be some regional distribution that underlies these global numbers. And what is this regional distribution? So integrated assessment models, like I said, a brief overview, consist of multiple modules, and this varies across models. They're not all the same, but more or less, this is what the structure is. You have macroeconomic models that look at, that follow standard neoclassical frameworks of general equilibrium theory or partial equilibrium theory. They maximize utility or welfare or something of the sort. So that is one module from where you get your GDP numbers, your consumption of goods and services numbers, etc., the economic numbers. You have, these are coupled with energy models. These are typically least cost models. You're looking at how do you minimize costs of abatement over a large period of time across the world. So you're essentially looking at where is it cheapest to mitigate, when is it cheapest to mitigate. And now with the 1.5 degrees Celsius target, of course, you have, you cannot do this simply by changing your energy system anymore. The remaining carbon budget is so less that you need to look at land dynamics as well. Land use and land use change is an important aspect of meeting mitigation targets. And so you have vegetation models that have been coupled to the energy models that give you land use dynamics. And of course, all of this has provides feedback to Earth system models, and you have radiative forcing levels for different levels of emissions. There are a whole lot of other emissions. This is an oversimplified structure, but broadly, just to give you an idea. So these are the models. Then what you have are the scenarios or the storylines. Again, there is a small subset of authors, of scholars in the global north that have produced the storylines. And the idea, of course, is that there will be more stakeholders that will participate. There will be discussions about what these storylines should be, can be, etc., etc. But currently, what you have is the storylines, and these storylines have what were used by the modelers to produce scenarios, and eventually, therefore, used in the assessment by the IPCC. Right? And so what the scenarios do, the storylines do, is construct a baseline which talks about how the world develops, and there are different ways the world can develop equally with and sustainably. The world can develop with using a high amount of fossil fuels. The world can develop with a lot of regional rivalry, etc., etc. So each storyline has a particular kind of vision for a future world, and then you have mitigation and adaptation effort at different temperature levels over and above this baseline. Right? And so you have multiple storylines. One storyline is, it's SSP1. They're called shared socioeconomic pathways. That's where the SSP comes from. So you have SSP1, which is sustainable and inclusive development. SSP5, which is fossil fuel development. And you have SSP2, 3, 4, which is SSP2 is middle of the road, SSP3 regional rivalry, SSP4 is inequality. So all of these storylines have a particular baseline through which they construct, and the mitigation and adaptation efforts are over and above these baselines, right? And these are fed into the models to then get out. So all the numbers that you see in the IPCC report in the summary for policymakers or in newspapers that then quote from the summary for policymakers are coming from these assessments. These are the outcomes of this entire process of modeling. Okay. So coming to the AR6, the IPCC AR6 global scenarios, there was a call for scenarios. Scenarios were submitted, of which only a fraction, 1,500, could be assigned a climate assessment, and there was vetting criteria that the authors had set. About 1,202 scenarios passed the vetting criteria. So about half of the scenarios that were actually submitted to the database did not get assessed for various reasons. Of these 1,202 scenarios, 700 correspond to the 1.5 and 2 degrees Celsius targets, which are the Paris Agreement goals. The others are higher temperature targets, 3 degrees, 4 degrees, corresponding to the RCP 8.5. Some, a lot of the comparisons in Working Group 1, for example, happen with this RCP 8.5, which is already a scenario that is no longer relevant. And the Working Group 3 report actually says this quite clearly. Of the 700, you have 556 scenarios which have a 10-region classification. And the IAMs classify regions by as geographical regions, right? They don't do other kinds of income classifications, etc., except where you have a 6-region classification. The OECD is an economic region, is an economic classification, but all other classifications are geographical, and I'll come to this a little bit later. And so you can look at a lot of indicators of GDP, primary energy consumption, etc., of this. And a subset of these have integrated land use components. And so if you want to look at food demand, the risk of population at hunger, land use for energy crops, etc., these are the scenarios to look at. Of the total 556, we could look at per capita values for 496 scenarios. But if you look at the distribution between how many scenarios fall into which storyline, SSP2, which is the middle of the road storyline, is basically dominated. It dominates the AR6. The results are dominated by this. You don't have a very small subset is the SSP1, which is the equity-driven storyline. However, is there too much of a difference between one storyline and the other? Is the modeling itself a problem, or is it the storylines that are the problem? Is a question that is relevant that we will come back to later. So what are the regional results, and what this is briefly what this is the work that we have done on the IPCC's, the scenarios assessed by the IPCC in the AR6. We've looked at 4 categories, C1 to C4, corresponding to the 1.5 degrees with overshoot and without overshoot, 2 degrees Celsius categories for 67 and 50% probability. And broadly, the 10 regions available can be classified into developed and developing, or Annex 1 regions under the UNFCCC and non-Annex regions under the UNFCCC. So this is the way in which we've done the analysis. So what is the projection for the world in 2050? Where is the world in 2050? Okay. Per capita GDP in the 1.5 degrees Celsius without overshoot scenarios, C1 scenarios, is increasing for every region, but it is increasing from already high levels to much higher levels for regions of the global north. If you look at sub-Saharan Africa, it goes from $3,000 in PPP terms per capita to about $9,000 per capita by 2050. In 30 years, that's how much it grows. And there has been, when we presented this work first, the reaction was, but there is a much higher percentage increase, right? So 3,000 to 9,000 is a 200% increase, whereas 54 to 72 is only a 33% increase. Right? So in percentage terms, it's a huge increase, but it's an increase from a very, very low baseline level. And this is one of the problems with giving numbers without context. And you see this across the climate policy literature. The United Nations Environment Program, the UNEP, produces an emissions gap report every year, and they do this regularly. They'll say, these countries have reduced emissions, whereas these countries have increased emissions. They will not tell you increased over what baseline level, decreased from what baseline level. Right? So increasing from 1 ton to 2 tons versus decreasing from 10 tons to 8 tons, which is, how do you compare these two numbers? And so the context, of course, of these numbers is everything. In the C3, which is the 2 degrees Celsius scenarios, you see no difference. Right? The per capita GDP in C3 scenarios is very similar. You have the same kind of numbers with marginal differences. So it's really being driven by the models or the storylines, and we'll come to that shortly. If you look at per capita consumption of goods and services in the 1.5 degrees Celsius scenarios, the situation is even starker. Right? Sub-Saharan Africa goes from 1,000 to 3,000, South Asia from 1,000 to 4,000, and North America from 35,000 to 59,000. So you have a very clear gap between the developed and the developing countries, in all kinds of economic variables. Again, C3 scenarios, in the 2 degrees Celsius scenarios, the numbers are not very different. Are they different when it comes to different storylines? Is the outcome, economic outcome, different if you assume a world that will grow more sustainably versus a world that will be middle of the road, meaning, historical trends continue into the future? The answer is not very much. Right? The inequalities continue to remain quite stark. And you get only a little bit of leeway to increase incomes in the poorest parts of the global south, in the poorest parts of the world, in sub-Saharan Africa, South Asia, and some of the other economies. Right? You have a little better, some improvement with SSP1, but not too much. So do the models allow for imagining a world which is far better off today than it was, far better off 30 years from now than it is today? They do allow it for the global north. However, that imagination is severely restricted when it comes to countries of the global south. Okay. I have to speed up, so I'm going to skip some of this. Our argument is that it's not just the scenarios you construct from the models, but the models themselves that need to be questioned. You have assumptions of Pareto optimality that drive the entire modeling framework in the integrated assessment modeling, which means basically that you can't make somebody better off by making somebody else worse off. So essentially, there is no distributive justice that is possible within the framework of this model. Right? You have specific weights that are assigned in the models to freeze income inequalities at current levels. Because there are papers by modelers themselves that state quite clearly, if you don't do this, the problem of underdevelopment overwhelms the problem of climate change in the models. And so you can't you'll get an outcome that equalizes incomes, perhaps. If you don't get, what in the modeling parlance is called infeasible outcomes, you'll get an equalization of incomes. Right? Will that be acceptable? Is it realistic to assume that incomes can equalize over a period of time if you actually want to solve the problem? So, okay, the short story is no distributive justice is possible within the framework, the general equilibrium, partial equilibrium, or even other kinds of frameworks that are currently used by the economic models. And the result is, of course, that you have a severe constraint on income and consumption of goods and services in the global in the global south. And there is a very strong correlation between this and per capita energy use. There is a decoupling that happens in between final energy use and GDP. Right? And that assumes, of course, that you can generate income, etc., with lower levels of final energy use, or there are assumptions of energy efficiency that play a role, of speculative technology in the future. But between primary energy consumption and GDP, the linkage remains strong across all scenarios in the C1 to C4 category. And so, therefore, what you have as a restriction on incomes also translates to a restriction on per capita energy use. So the difference between per capita energy use projected for 2050 between the richest countries, so the red bars are developed countries and the blue bars are developing countries. So the first bar that you see there is North America, and the last one that you see is Sub-Saharan Africa. There's a 6 to 8 time difference, not today, but in 2050. These are projections for 2050. Right? This continues. While there is a reduction in per capita energy use that is assumed, the energy use itself stays far above in the global north than it is projected to even grow, even from very, very low levels in the developing countries. You know, some years ago there was a paper that was published or some report that was published that compared an American refrigerator with the per capita consumption of some African countries. You know, and so that situation doesn't change even 30 years from now in the projected scenarios. So this is, of course, facilitated by higher per capita fossil fuel use, even as late as 2050 in developed countries. So if you look at coal consumption, it reduces for everybody, and it reduces much faster for some than others. But, so North America, for example, goes from 38 gigajoules per person to 2 gigajoules per person, whereas Sub-Saharan Africa goes from 3 to 0, right? So even when you are very low, you are expected to go to zero coal, but North America continues to use coal. This is an average of scenarios, so it continues to use coal even in 2050. Oil consumption, again, reduces for everybody from much low baseline levels for developing countries as compared to developed countries. And again, developed countries continue to remain pretty high, even in relatively higher, even in 2050. Gas consumption, same story, a little bit of increase in South Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa, but very minor. So, of course, that translates to higher per capita fossil fuel consumption overall in the developed countries as compared to developing countries, even in 2050. And this is compensated by higher carbon dioxide sequestration in the developing countries. So you have land-based mitigation and CCS that is assumed to be much higher. This is, of course, BECCS through energy crops is assumed to be much higher in the global south. So across models, this holds. You have the projected amount of CO2 sequestration is higher than even the remaining carbon budget in some of the models. And most of it, a large majority of it, in all models, is to come from countries of the global south. So, and this has severe consequences, and these have been listed in the literature. They are, in fact, even referred to in the full IPCC report. Unfortunately, there is this kind of discussion on the problems of the linkages of the numbers, the 43% reduction, the assumptions of CO2 sequestration, right? The carbon dioxide removal, CDR, in that number. And what its implications are for food security, for example, in the global south, do not find a clear discussion in the SPM or even in the longer report. It's buried in a chapter somewhere, right? So you have, there are, of course, concerns that have been raised across the board on what this means on high reliance on CDR. And a serious concern for the global south is that this has a direct impact on food insecurity and a significant increase in the number of people at risk of hunger under stringent mitigation pathways. So, you have diversification of land for energy crops, a rapid increase in land under afforestation and reforestation, and you have suppressed demand in per capita food consumption for livestock products and food crops. So this is there are papers that address this, and then, of course, say that the solution for this can be food aid, or subsidies, which are, again, either, will increase the reliance of the global south on countries of the global north, or are advocating policies that are opposed by developed countries in other fora, in trade negotiations, for example. So as a result of all of this, what you have is a contravention of the principles of equity and CBDRRC that are there in both the convention and its Paris Agreement. You have much higher near-term reductions that are projected for the poorest countries. So sub-Saharan Africa is to cut emissions starting immediately at much higher rates as compared to Western Europe or North America, right? Which is absurd. From very low levels, they cut at much higher rates as compared to some of the richest countries with highest responsibilities and highest capacities in the world. And Latin America, of course, is also supposed to cut rapidly and, in fact, reach net zero much before any of the developed countries, and provide the sink for global emissions for continued fossil fuel use, even as late as 2050 in the developed countries. And so what you have is, in the long term, and this was the short term, so which is 2030 emissions reductions, 2020 to 2030. What you have is a continued disproportionate grab of the carbon budget projected, as you have in the past. So it will be even in the future. A small proportion of the global population, which is 19% of the Annex 1 countries, basically are responsible for 68% of historical emissions, but they will continue to be responsible for a larger share of the emissions, the total emissions, even when the entire carbon budget is considered, even what is left for the future. So let me sort of go to the alternative. I have about 5 to 7 minutes left, and so I needed to establish this so that I could go ahead. Current models and scenarios are unacceptable to developing countries for these reasons. You have a rhetoric of radical change. You have a language of transformation that is peppered across the IPCC reports, but it is not translated to operationalizing even fundamental requirements such as poverty eradication and meeting basic goals of zero hunger in developing countries. You have a misrepresentation of science to serve policy agendas. The net zero is a classic example. You have the Working Group 1 that uses the language of net zero so often, whereas it makes it clear right from the beginning that it is cumulative emissions that is the metric that encompasses everything, the carbon budget and net zero. So it's not the timing of net zero that is important, but how you get there that is important, how much you emit till you reach net zero. So, but you have the IPCC report talking about net zero much more, and this is what gets picked up even in the IPCC outreach presentations, because this is leading up to Glasgow, right? Working Group 1 was leading up to the Glasgow Climate Conference, and this was a big agenda. Declaration of net zero targets was a big agenda at the Glasgow conference. The next one is going to be overshoot pathways. Having done nothing to limit warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius, but if you keep on speaking about keeping it alive, you've made it a political, a point of ego now, keeping 1.5 degrees Celsius alive. It is not about the people who are going to suffer if it is no longer alive. It is about, keeping the narrative alive. And so you will, it'll move on to overshoot pathways. And the overshoot pathways basically are you overshoot a temperature target, but you return back, let's say, to 1.5 over in this century. But a lot of these, most of this or all of these overshoot pathways basically depend on third world biosphere. They will depend on land-based mitigation, the forests of the global south to meet these targets, just as the non-overshoot pathways still also depend largely on, to a large extent, not largely, to a large extent on land-based mitigation in the global south. A lot of authors use financial transfer, say that, yes, there is a problem of equity, but the models can't handle equity. Let's deal with the questions of equity outside by saying we will have financial transfers that happen outside. Okay, but there is no discussion about the fact that there's no money on the table, right? The first number that was promised by the developed countries came 17 years after they agreed to give money in the UNFCCC. And it's been 14 years since then, and it's still not met. That target is not met, and it's a fraction of what is going to be required for a transition in the global energy system. And at the end of the day, one has to still ask the question, is finance going to solve the problem if you don't, it cannot translate to providing material well-being? What do people in South Asia do? You know, the money that they get, they burn it to then cook their food on, boil their water on. You need physical energy, right? How are we going to solve that problem if you're not going to address it? So, yeah. So, you know, let me, like I said, go over to the need for a new scenarios framework for equitable and climate compatible futures, right? Let us not begin with what is quote unquote pragmatic. Now, I'm not sure this is, I'm of course using the language of that, you know, of IPCC modelers, authors, etc., who have responded to a certain extent by saying, look, this is as realistic as it will get. This is how the world will look like, right? So if this is, but you know, CDR of 500 gigatons is realistic, but imagining a world that is less unequal is for some reason not realistic. So let's not begin with what's realistic and what's not based on where you come from, but let us begin with what is necessary. Let us not explore the cheapest pathways to climate action. Let's explore the most equitable ones. There is some problem. Yeah. And let us look at what is necessary to achieve a future that is livable for all. Can we imagine an equitable and climate compatible future? And this is we were hoping that we would be able to put the preprint out before today's talk, but unfortunately, we've not been able to complete that work. And so this paper will be out soon, but I'm sort of giving just a brief glimpse of the kind of work that we are doing. We are looking at a new country classification based on development, multiple indicators of human development, energy access, etc., etc. This geographical classification is, if you want an example of the modern manifestation of colonial anthropology, you have it there, right? The OECD are the only economies. The rest of us are only important for our biosphere. Right? We are only geographies. We are not economies. You might have China, who's manufacturing for the world. You might have India, who's a digital powerhouse, etc., etc. But in the imagination of the modeling community, we are simply basically forests. As my colleague Raban would say, 23 degrees north and south of the equator, we are basically just large green patches meant to absorb emissions of the global north. Right? So we look at a different, even the World Bank classification, I must say, is better than the classification, the geographical classification used by the IAM community. So what we do is we have a new country classification based on development. We look at energy and income thresholds for sustainable development. We use a method which I'm not going to go into the details of, but covering indicators of health, education, and infrastructure. This is beyond the sufficiency literature, the literature that looks at sufficiency or decent living standards, because while, again, even in that literature, there is a lot of language of radical and transformational change. Eventually, when you allocate energy thresholds, you basically just look at poverty eradication, right? And the global south has aspirations beyond simply not starving. It does, unfortunately, the scholars of the global north, civil society across the global north, and even, I must say, scholars and civil society in the global south must understand some of these issues. We then construct scenarios for energy conversions and also do a comparison with inequitable energy futures. And then we look at climate equity for the 1.5 and 2 degrees Celsius targets with a per capita fair share of the remaining carbon budget, and do comparative scenarios of what happens if you meet or do not meet climate equity. And then we look at what is the energy GDP decoupling that is required. So let me just skip this because I don't have time, but if there are questions, I can take them in the Q&A session. But, let me just give a brief overview of some of the results. Okay? It's very clear. The results are also quite intuitive. If you consider both energy and climate equity, and we consider countries converging to about 94 gigajoules of energy by 2050. right? And that's quite a steep increase for some of the countries of the global south. So this is for an entire group together. For the lowest development group, we have 4 groups. The first is the high development, medium development, low development, and least development. For the least development group, it's a very steep increase in energy, but we do assume that that is necessary to meet developmental thresholds. And there can be, of course, it varies across different kinds of development indicators. But so the equity scenario is where you converge in terms of energy. Energy inequity scenario is where the least developed countries stay at 20 gigajoules. The low development countries go up to 40. The medium development do better because they're already on a trajectory of fast increase. They go to 160 gigajoules. And the highest developed, the most developed countries stay where they are at 236 gigajoules, right? With climate equity and inequity, simply a comparison with what happens if you get the fair share of your carbon, of the, even at least the remaining carbon budget, not the full budget, the remaining carbon budget, and what happens if you don't get the fair share of your remaining carbon budget. So this first bar is for G1, which are the richest countries. The 14% of the global population, most of the OECD is here, right? If you consider both energy and climate equity, you need a energy emissions decoupling of about 8.2%, currently at around 1.5%. You need to increase that decoupling to about 8.2% between now and 2050, meaning even if the richest countries reduce their energy consumption from the current levels of 236 over 200 gigajoules to 94 gigajoules, which is the sufficiency condition, they will still need to decouple emissions from energy use at a much, much faster rate than they are currently. Right? If you have energy equity, meaning their energy consumption does reduce and converge with the developing countries, but they get a higher share of the carbon budget, their burden is very low. It's 1.4%, more or less what they're doing currently. Right? If you have neither energy nor climate equity, then you have a 2.7%, again, fairly doable. So it's not very difficult for developed countries to remain where they are if they can be assured of a disproportionate share of the carbon budget, and if they can be assured that they don't have to change their energy consumption systems or patterns. So then you have a problem. And of course, this trend reverses almost exactly when you come to least developed countries. Their burdens, everybody still has a burden, right? Because you have such little carbon space left that irrespective of where you are on the developmental ladder, you are going to have to do something about climate change if we want to keep to limiting global warming. Right? So everybody has a burden, but it is much more plausible to assume that the poorest countries will be able to take on this burden much more realistically if their well-being is assured, if their incomes increase, if their energy consumption increases, they'll be also able to take a higher mitigation burden. Right? But if you have neither energy nor climate equity, you have extremely high burdens on the least developed and the low developed regions. And very interestingly, the global burden doesn't change too much. You can have a world without equity and you can have a world with equity. But what is behind that number is vastly different in terms of the implications. So let me just end by saying that you need higher efforts from all, but much higher efforts from rich countries. I mean, that's a no-brainer. We need to transition. We've moved on from the sixth assessment report is over. There is a new IPCC bureau that has been elected, and hopefully, some of the issues that have been raised in the sixth assessment report will be addressed. We remain hopeful. But the question is this: you have the language of transformation, and now it is, of course, also applied to adaptation. You have transformational adaptation. You have etc. That language is being used, and it's, of course, it couples mitigation to adaptation across the board. And if you look at the examples of transformational adaptation, but the point is to not just pay lip service to it and use it as jargon and use it in rhetoric, but actually operationalize it in what you set as targets for the future. Pragmatism or realism cannot be a justification for projecting continued poverty and deprivation in the global south. So you can't assume that ambition in technology and speculative technologies of carbon dioxide removal is realistic, but reducing inequality and poverty is utopian and is not realistic. The current models very clearly project a future that we in the global south do not want. So using results from these models as benchmarks in climate policy is unacceptable. And so, we hope that, more people who are, concerned about creating a world which is both climate compatible and just in the future will ask these questions of modelers, of, scholars, both in the global north and the global south. And hopefully some of this might be addressed sooner rather than later. So I'll end here. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Tejal, for this tour de force. Really, it's also just a stark reminder of the fact that science and modeling is not neutral, and you might have these technical terms like Pareto optimality or cost optimality, but if it just perpetuates colonial injustices, then it's not a neutral endeavor, and we should, as you do, question and contest it. I want to give it up for questions. If people have questions, you can put them either in the chat or raise your hand using the Zoom functionality, and then you can speak. There's one comment on geoengineering in the chat, which I will glance over. Maybe while people think about questions, I have one that is, I mean, I have many questions, but one maybe first is I'm curious how this kind of work has been received also by the modeling community more broadly, and whether you see it's really like a complete uphill battle, or you think things are beginning to change there.
Well, the modeling community is also, is not one homogeneous entity, although it's a very, very small and very, very elite club situated largely in the global north. We have presented this work, at COP27, and then subsequently at other fora, even in some of the IPCC workshops, in fact. And there has been engagement with it, right? Whether there is willingness to change significantly, and the fact that if you don't eventually, if you don't address questions of equity, you're not going to get buy-in from countries that matter in determining what kind of action we take for the future, is, I think, sinking in. So there has to be some way of addressing it. The question remains how it ends up getting addressed. There is the resistance by a certain section, of course, and you have an unfortunate situation where there's a large overlap between. So because you have a very, very small modeling community, it's the same people who are IPCC authors, it's the same people who do this, who build the models, the same people who produce the scenarios, and the same people sitting on editorial boards of journals that publish papers, right? So it becomes, it is an uphill task sometimes to get something that is, that questions and criticizes this accepted and read. But yeah, this paper has been out in the public domain for about over 6 months now, and there has been, the chair of Working Group 3, co-chair of Working Group 3, came to the event where we first spoke about these numbers. He is now the IPCC chair, Jim Skee. And he said, he said he's not surprised with the numbers. Of course, he attributed it to the storylines and not to the models themselves, and said if there were more SSP1 storylines, we would perhaps have better outcomes. But I mean, I don't believe that will solve the problem. We need far more radical solutions to solve the problem, a different way in which the assessment is done to address the issue. So it's a bit of a long answer to your question, because it's both yes and no.
Yeah. No, thank you. And there are a couple of questions that are related, I believe. One is, do you know what the reasons are that modelers give to why the Global South is where most sequestration is projected? I think you mentioned something that it's just cheaper there.
Sorry, I can't see this. I
sorry.
can't see the question. So
okay, let me just read it.
Why is it? Yeah.
Yeah. What reasons do modelers give as to why most of the sequestration is projected to take place in the Global South, the carbon sequestration?
Yeah, so there is no reason per se given for individual results like that. It's difficult to find it in the IPCC reports, at least. But the reason, if you dig into the papers, I mean, it's very clear that it is assumed to be cheaper. Even if you look at the cost of abatement estimates that are there in the IPCC, it's assumed that a FOLU sector, agriculture, forestry, and land use sector, mitigation is cheap. So you can get large amounts of mitigation from land-based mitigation measures.
There is also one question here. How can those of us in the global north studying this and those that are concerned with equity or equality assist?
Yeah, I think we need a, and there is, I must say, we must acknowledge the fact that there are also people from the global north who have supported some of this work and, have spoken about it in their own way, in the forums as well. But what I think is, really is a need to go beyond this idea that the only way in which we can have projections for the future is through this, a small set of integrated assessment models. So can we not have, equity-based scenarios for the future? Why is it the burden only of scholars in the global south to construct equity-based scenarios? I mean, equity, justice are universal concepts. The fact that most of these scenarios are from the global south, global north, is not, in fact, good enough reason for there to be a lack of equity in them, because these are universal concepts, right? And so perhaps, doing, and there need not be just one framework, there can be multiple frameworks, but we need much more literature. We need much more work that focuses and foregrounds questions of equity, doesn't consider it as an afterthought. Once you've achieved a climate, a 1.5 degrees Celsius world or a climate world, then you think about, but this means high investments in the global south, so let's deal with the problem through some financial transfers post facto. Instead of thinking of it like that, foreground questions of equity and begin with that. It's if we can imagine a world which is equitable, we'll be able to imagine modeling frameworks also which can model that world. If such an imagination of such a world itself is not possible, then we'll be stuck with IIMs. But I think it's very possible to go beyond the integrated assessment models.
Yeah, it's interesting because, of course, it is so central inequity on some level on climate policy, right? I remember reading Todd Stern, the Obama special envoy on climate change, saying leading up to the Paris Agreement, if equity is in, we're out, right? Or if you just look at, for example, Europe, right, who celebrates itself on becoming the first climate neutral continent by 2050, right? As you point out, I mean, it's actually a scandal on some level. It's shameful because if you look at just the historical responsibility, I mean, they are in a huge climate debt, as you point out, right? So it's not only, the modeling that needs to be kind of become more progressive on some level, right? But it's really actually the hegemonic discourse with respect to climate policy that needs to change, and that seems actually very hard. I'm not sure whether you have kind of interventions here that you imagine could be powerful.
So I think, one of the reasons I think why the convention is, if you look at developing country interventions at the negotiations or the summaries that the negotiations puts up, etc. You look at how often developing countries refer to the UNFCCC, the convention, the principles of the convention, right? Because you have principles that are fundamental to our understanding of what the problem is, where it has come from, and what is needed to solve it, that are embedded in the convention. The principles of equity and CPDRRC are very much there. And irrespective of what the US says or Europe says and does, they are parties to the convention. So in that sense, and of course, the Paris Agreement is also includes the same language. It's not as if it does not include that language. It in fact says it's supposed to enhance the implementation of the convention, right? So you have parties that are signatories to all of these international agreements. It's the operationalization. So there is no disagreement in that sense, or at least on paper, there is no disagreement, right? But its operationalization is a problem, and you're trying to circumvent the fact that you have to operationalize it in some way by these kinds of global targets, by talking of ambition as more important than equity, by talking of equity as something that is an obstacle for ambition, by talking about global targets without any kind of differentiation. The new game in town, for example, is global renewable energy targets, right? There is a call for global targets for renewable energy, without any discussion of how they should link to fossil fuel phase out. So where will this new renewable energy installed capacity will be? We're tripling renewable energy capacity, right? IRENA has given the call. Where is it going to be? The electricity demand in India and China is growing at over 6%. Electricity demand in Europe is reducing slightly. Electricity demand in the US is growing at 0.0112%. So unless you couple this with some kind of differentiation or even a fossil fuel phase out in developed countries, the additional capacity that the US will need is so less that most of the additional, the target for tripling is going to be on the heads of large emerging economies in the global south, right? So it seems benign on the face of it that you have a global target and you rally markets and capital to sort of follow and get the investment ready for that target. But it's largely going to be a burden that is to be borne by those countries that are increasing their energy consumption today, that have not done it in the past, that don't have infrastructure. So you're talking about systems and energy systems transitions, etc. We don't even have those systems in place to transition out of them. What do you transition from, right? We are not decarbonizing. We are going from an undercarbonized economy to an uncarbonized economy. So it's a very different transition for us as compared to developed countries. So operationalizing this, so there is, and I agree with you, but there are various ways in which the question of equity, which is agreed on paper, is circumvented. And this entire business of global targets is the new way in which this is done.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. One question that seems a bit related is, and you mentioned this a little bit, right? That countries like India or so, they're just not going to take directions, if you will, from the Western world if equity is not on the table. Do you see some initiative emerging, or is there an initiative where global South countries really collectively, form groups and really stand against this inequality and inequity with regards to climate policy? Are they pushing for I don't know, this increase of using historical emissions, for example, and so on and so forth?
Yeah, so this has been part of what developing countries have, said historically let's say in climate policy negotiations, at the multilateral negotiations, developing countries have said this. There are groups, of course, but developing countries are a large number of countries and very, very diverse national circumstances. And so you have differences there in terms of also what are priorities, right? For the small island states, for example, it really is a question of loss and damage and urgency of mitigation, irrespective of who does it, because it's an existential issue for them. And one must understand that. For large emerging economies that have huge populations to support, to employ, to, industrialization, mechanization, etc., are serious challenges that one must contend with. So you have diversity even in the developing country groups. But across the board, I think equity and CBDRRC is something that the G77 and China group has put forward quite strongly. The problem is, you see, with the scenarios and with some of these numbers, right? The 43% reduction number, etc. And, developing countries, even India, etc., everybody accepted these numbers in good faith in Glasgow, because, the database of the regional classification of the scenarios, etc., was not made public till a year later. And once you analyze it, you see what lies under the numbers. So then what do you, what governments eventually do, etc., is, of course, a different thing that is up to the governments to do, right? But I'm not here as a spokesperson of any government or the Global South, for that matter. I'm simply a researcher in the Global South. And for me, it really is a serious issue that you have these global numbers that we are supposed to accept as though this is some objective fact, whereas in fact they are not. And any discussion on equity is subjective, whereas some of these numbers are supposed to be accepted as objective. So, as somebody who would, if I am to ask my government, I would say don't accept these numbers. Unless you have a framework for equity based on which you have global targets, these numbers cannot be accepted. Whether or not how governments deal with it and how they address this question is a separate issue. But you do see government, developing country groups come together and talk about historical responsibility, talk about problems with global targets, talk about scenarios. I think the Third World Network produces a summary of ongoing negotiations at every COP and the intersessional of the subsidiary bodies as well. And if you actually read these reports, it would be a good meta-analysis to do, an analysis of the Third World Network bulletins, actually to see how many times developing country and developing country groups have spoken about this, have spoken about these problems, and how much of it is actually reflected in climate policy or final COP decisions.
Yeah. There's one, maybe we take one last question that's slightly more specific from Vishal. He asks, what are your thoughts on the projection of carbon markets or emissions trading systems as a precondition for meaningful climate action on part of the Global South? For instance, he was listening to Rockström at PIC, who highlighted the concerns with the present emissions trajectory well, but pointed towards institutionalization of carbon markets in the Global South as the next step. Is this framing fair? So the question.
The short answer is no. The framing is patently unfair. And so the problem is with carbon markets is what will you trade and based on what, right? Is there, if you want to trade, establish an entitlement first. Talk about what is a fair entitlement to the global atmospheric space. And then if you have, if you cannot, what you can only sell what you're entitled to sell. You cannot what you are not entitled to sell. So then, how do carbon markets work when you refuse to put any kind of discussion on entitlement on the table, right? And the other thing is, we need mitigation in developed countries. I think the largest problem that in the scenarios is that it is all expected to happen elsewhere. So you continue. There is some mitigation, of course, that happens in developed countries, but a large chunk of it is basically happening outside of developed countries, in the developing countries, not only through continued poverty there, but also through land-based mitigation. So it's fine. We will not, Europe is not going to reduce gas. It's in fact going to change. It's going to call some kinds of use of natural gas as green. I mean, the nomenclature has changed. So and whatever Europe can't do, it'll get done in India or Brazil or Africa through the forests there, so the biosphere of those regions, right? So then it'll pay for something like that. So, but what does it actually mean in terms of getting mitigation done or addressing questions of sustainable development in those regions is completely unanswered in this entire framing of carbon markets. So yes, so that is unfortunately, I would say that no, it's not a fair framing at all.
Yeah. Thank you for that answer. We have okay, one really last question that came up a couple of times. I'm just being reminded that it has been asked, that essentially asks, I'm not sure whether this is answerable for you in 3 minutes, but it says, can we change the whole governance model system at a global scale, and how?
No, so I don't think also that's the right way to think about it, because in a highly unequal world, if you talk about global governance, it's going to be like you want another IMF, another World Bank, another system which is controlled by those who have more power today. So there is something to be said for sovereignty, for national circumstances and priorities. But that doesn't mean that we are restricted in terms of coming together to solve a problem. And the fact that we can do that, we can collectively, globally address a problem, through cooperation without necessarily infringing on sovereignty and sovereign systems, is not that difficult. I mean, it's not that unimaginable, is what I'm saying. It's simply, so, going into the direction of a global governance system, etc., in the kind of world we live in, I would say is going slightly in a much more dangerous direction. While respecting national sovereignty, looking at ways in which we can encourage global cooperation, I think, and come together to be able to solve this problem is perhaps a much better way to think about it. Whether that can be done, given how reticent developed countries are and developed country governments are, is a difficult one to answer. But you have 82% of the population in the global south. There's far more countries, and so when the G77 plus China group says something, it carries some weight. A large number of countries put their weight behind questions of equity and climate justice. So it's not a trivial thing, even for some of the most powerful governments like the United States to simply ignore and dismiss. And so that power should not be underestimated.
Yeah. Nice. That was actually a very nice answer. So with that, I want to conclude the session here with you, Tejal. Thank you very much for your time, and also for really this fantastic work you and your colleagues are doing. I want to shift now quickly to talk a little bit about scientist rebellion for 5 or 6 minutes, and then conclude the session, how you can get involved also. So let me share my slides here. I hope this works. Can you see my slides? Yeah. Okay, so let me briefly talk about the scientist rebellion, its motivation, and how I can get involved. And I want to keep this short, so I'm not going to talk about the scale of the emergency or the recent and ongoing extreme weather events and the science that keeps coming out telling us it's worse than anticipated. Instead, I want to focus on the science and policy interface, where I think we are seeing a failure of communication, of listening, of epic proportions. And a prime example is the last sentence of the summary for policymakers of the Working Group 2 contribution to the latest IPCC report, where it says, and it's really a sentence for the history books, it says, any further delay in concerted anticipatory global action on adaptation and mitigation will miss a brief and rapidly closing window of opportunity to secure a livable and sustainable future for all. And this is basically, you know, the scientific community telling the world, telling policymakers, hey, if we don't act fast and at scale, we're cooked. And all governments approved of this sentence. Now, while the language in this and other reports have become more stark and the predictions more dire, reports like these are nothing new, right? And so the next graph, which some of you might know already, almost, you know, breaks your heart, showing that we've known about the problem for decades. So these are the years. This is the carbon dioxide concentration in the atmosphere. We've known about the problem for decades. We had the first IPCC report in 1990. We had conference after parties after conference after parties every year, talking endlessly, but we barely made a dent in the global emissions. And even now, you know, as we're moving into this era of loss and damage, where climate impacts are getting worse and worse, governments continue to expand fossil fuel infrastructure. And this is this proportion, this is really this failure of listening and of communication, where the science is screaming, hey, we have to stop, we have to fundamentally transform our economy, our society, and yet governments continue on the path of destruction, right? We have Fatih Birol here saying there can be no new investments in oil and gas if governments are serious about the climate crisis. This is 2021, also from 2021, the production gap report showing, but actually governments plan to produce more than twice the amount of fossil fuels in 2030 that will be consistent with warming to 1.5 degrees. Here for coal, you see it here, the production planned and the production consistent with 1 and 2 degrees of warming, the same for oil and gas. So they're either continuing on a path of destruction or acting too slowly to avert a catastrophe. And so here we are, you know, in 2023, and it's not, to be honest, it's not looking so good. And what we have to understand is that it is not a problem of information deficit, right? It's not a problem of a lack of IPCC reports. We had 6 IPCC reports so far, but it is a problem of entrenched power, be it fossil fuel corporations, big agricultural corporations, rich individuals with a high carbon intense lifestyle that they seek to protect consciously or unconsciously, right? These forms of entrenched power perpetuating the status quo. And what we have to do to overcome this entrenched power is basically have a huge mobilization of society, build the most inclusive, biggest social movement in history to put pressure on government and corporations to act in accordance with the living world. And you know, we don't do this as academics by continuing to write papers. Instead, we have to, you know, rethink the role of scientists and engage with how social change happens at a massive and urgent scale. We can't allow science as usual. And this is what Scientist Rebellion does in theory and in practice. Scientist Rebellion is a global movement of scientists and academics from all disciplines, from PhD students to full professors, who engage in civil disobedience, which is a tried and tested tactic from past social movements to effect rapid change. And civil disobedience means consciously, publicly, non-violently breaking certain aspects of the law to signal an injustice, to signal to the wider public that we're in an emergency, and to signal that we don't stand by as the living world is destroyed, as, you know, our hopes, our dreams, and the hopes and dreams of our loved ones are being destroyed. And in April 2022, when the Working Group 3 report came out, we had big actions all over the world, blocking government ministries, corporations, engaging academic strikes, occupations, and so on, leading to mass arrests and global press coverage. And that kicked off very many local scientist rebellion groups, you know, in Italy, in Latin America, in Africa, in North America, in Australia, you know, here in the Netherlands, where I'm also. And it's kind of nice to see how it became this, you know, from this handful of co-organizers, at least in the Netherlands where I'm based, to this really thriving academic community that is eager to create change. And it really does wonders to your mental health to engage in these forms of actions and share your concerns with others. And these local groups engage in their local struggles. Here in the Netherlands, we focus a lot on, universities cutting ties with the fossil fuel industry or banning private jets and so on. But we regularly come together also as a global movement and engage in actions across many different countries. And we've done so again in April 2023, in October 2022, and throughout the year. And if you're interested, you can look at our website here, scientistrebellion.org, for this information on past campaigns and future events. But I want to go back to this graph here, where you really see this epic failure, this decades of wasted time that have really put us into a corner now, in this dire predicament where what we do, today, this decade, will determine not only our future as we're here, or the future of our children, but really the future of life on Earth for centuries, possibly millennia to come. And it is surreal, it is maddening, it's unjust that we find ourselves in this moment. And there's a scene in The Lord of the Rings that I recall many times when I think about these things, and it's Frodo who says, "I wish the ring had never come to me. I wish none of this had happened." And then Gandalf says, "So do all who live to see such times, but that is not for them to decide. All we have to decide is what to do with the time that is given to us." And so I highly recommend you getting involved with your local grassroots climate organizations. It can be Scientist Rebellion, it can be others. You can find the information here. It's also posted in the Zoom chat. Sign up to a forum. We put you in touch with the local Scientist Rebellion group and get you up to speed. And it does wonders for your mental health. And involvement on all levels is needed. You don't have to engage in civil disobedience and get arrested. We also need many people in the background writing press releases, talking to media, giving trainings, all kinds of things that are required in the struggle for a livable Earth. So with that, I thank you for your attention, and hope to see you on the ground. Bye-bye.